Even after Chris Watts was sentenced to multiple life terms without parole, the silence surrounding the full truth of his monstrous acts continued to haunt investigators, the victim's family, and a captivated public. While his guilty plea had provided legal finality, the why and the granular how of the murders remained shrouded in the self-serving narrative he had initially offered. His first confession, delivered during the August interrogation, was a calculated attempt to mitigate his guilt, particularly concerning the deaths of his daughters. It lacked the chilling, unvarnished detail that could truly convey the scale of his depravity. For Shanann's parents, Frank and Cindy Zuchek, and her brother Frankie Jr., knowing Chris Watts was incarcerated was a form of justice, but it wasn't the whole picture. They were tormented by the incomplete details, by the thought that their daughter and grandchildren's final moments were still obscured by Chris's lies. They yearned for every piece of the truth, not for vengeance, but for comprehension, for a complete understanding of the nightmare their loved ones had endured. This persistent desire for answers to fully expose the darkness of Chris Watts fueled a critical next step in the investigation. Recognizing these lingering questions, and with a commitment to providing the fullest possible account of the tragedy, investigators from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, CBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, and the Weld County Sheriff's Office decided to pursue further interviews with Chris Watts. These would not be hurried interrogations aimed at securing a confession, but rather methodical discussions designed to extract the complete, unvarnished truth from a man who now had nothing left to lose. The goal was to fully understand the timeline, the precise sequence of events, and Chris's true mental state during those horrific hours. The pivotal interviews took place on February 18, 2019, approximately 3 months after his sentencing, within the confines of a maximum security prison in Wisconsin, where Chris Watts had been transferred for his own safety. The setting was stark, a sterile prison room, devoid of distractions, designed for stark conversation. The atmosphere was controlled yet different from the initial interrogation. Chris Watts was no longer fighting for his freedom. He was already condemned. This fundamental shift in his circumstances arguably opened the door for a more complete revelation. Why did Chris Watts agree to speak further, to confess the full horror of his actions? The motivations of individuals like him are complex. With no hope of release, some might seek a form of morbid understanding, a chance to explain themselves however twisted their logic. Others might be driven by a desire for control over the narrative, even if that narrative is one of unspeakable evil. For Chris, it might have been a combination of these factors. The crushing weight of isolation, the persistent prodding by investigators who refused to let him off the hook, and perhaps a fragmented, deeply buried need to finally unburden himself, even if the truth was far more monstrous than anyone had imagined. These prison interviews would prove to be the critical turning point, finally providing the agonizing details that would shock the world anew and forever seal the terrifying legacy of Christopher Watts. When Chris Watts appeared for his February 2019 prison interviews, his outward presentation had undeniably changed, yet in many ways it remained disturbingly consistent. Stripped of the public's gaze and the need to maintain a charade of innocence, he was no longer the distraught husband who pleaded on television, nor the stoic, downcast figure in court. He was simply inmate Christopher Watts, serving multiple life sentences. His physical appearance reflected the harsh realities of incarceration. His head was shaved, his body perhaps slightly softer or more gaunt, depending on the period of his imprisonment. Dressed in standard prison attire, the last vestiges of his former life had been physically erased. Despite these external changes, Chris's core demeanor remained chillingly familiar. He was still remarkably calm, composed, and quiet. There were no outbursts of anger, no visible signs of profound distress, and critically no tears of remorse even as he began to recount the most agonizing details of his crimes. This emotional flatness, which had perplexed and repelled observers from the very beginning, continued to be his most unsettling characteristic. It was a composure so profound it bordered on robotic, a stark contrast to the raw emotion expected from someone discussing the murder of his own family. His interactions with the investigators, CBI agent Tammy Lee, FBI agent Graham Coder, and other law enforcement personnel, were notably cooperative. He spoke in a measured tone, answering questions directly, often with a matter-of-fact detachment. This willingness to engage, now that his fate was sealed, allowed for a deeper exploration of his actions and motivations. He wasn't resisting or denying, but rather methodically recounting. This shift from evasion to cooperation was a crucial element in obtaining the fuller confession, as he seemingly had nothing left to lose by revealing the truth. The context of these prison interviews was profoundly different from his initial interrogation. In August 2018, he was still fighting for his freedom, attempting to manipulate the narrative and playing a desperate game of denial. Now, in February 2019, he was already condemned. The psychological burden of maintaining the lies for external validation was gone. This shift allowed for a different kind of truth to emerge, one driven not by a need to escape punishment, but perhaps by a twisted form of intellectual honesty, or even a morbid desire to control his own narrative for posterity. He was no longer trying to convince anyone of his innocence, but rather laying out the full, agonizing details of his guilt. The unsettling nature of his composure during these interviews, even as he described smothering his children, left an indelible mark on the investigators. To hear such horrific acts recounted with such dispassionate clarity was deeply disturbing. It underscored the profound psychological chasm between Chris Watts and typical human emotion. His demeanor behind bars served as a chilling confirmation of the remorseless killer lurking beneath the veneer of normalcy, a man who, even when confronted with the full extent of his depravity, remained unnervingly calm. This composure was not a sign of strength or peace, but rather a chilling testament to his profound detachment and the terrifying reality of his chosen path. Securing a guilty plea from Chris Watts was a triumph for the prosecution, but for the investigators, and particularly for the Razuchek family, the story remained frustratingly incomplete. Chris's initial confession was riddled with inconsistencies and self-serving omissions, most notably his grotesque attempt to blame Shanann for the girls' deaths. To obtain the unvarnished truth, the approach had to shift dramatically. No longer was it an interrogation aimed at conviction, but a patient, strategic effort to unravel the final layers of deception. The core of this strategy rested on building a peculiar form of rapport with Chris Watts, even in the chilling context of his incarceration. Investigators, particularly CBI agent Tammy Lee and FBI agent Graham Coder, adopted a non-confrontational, almost conversational tone. They were not there to accuse or to judge. but to listen. Their goal was to create an environment where Chris felt he could finally speak freely, believing he had nothing left to lose, and perhaps even a twisted sense of relief in unburdening himself. This required immense patience and a psychological resilience to sit with a confessed family annihilator and engage him on his own terms. The investigator started by discussing his daily life in prison, his routine, and his adjustment to incarceration. This seemingly innocuous conversation served to ease him into the interview, to break down his psychological defenses. They allowed him to speak without immediate interruption, letting him feel heard. Over hours, and potentially across multiple sessions, they gradually steered the conversation towards the events of August 13th, approaching the sensitive topics with a measured pace, probing gently rather than aggressively. They focused on the minute details, the logistics, the feelings he experienced, or claimed to experience, slowly chipping away at the remaining lies. Crucially, Chris Watts was no longer under the immediate pressure of an impending trial. His fate was sealed. He knew he would never leave prison. This removal of legal jeopardy was a powerful psychological lever. With nothing to gain from continued denial and everything to lose from a conscience that, however distorted, might still be seeking some form of resolution, he became more amenable to revealing the full scope of his actions. The investigators understood that for certain personality types, the act of confessing, even to the most heinous crimes, can offer a perverse sense of control or release, a final narrative shaping. The breakthrough came gradually. As the investigators patiently listened and asked targeted questions, Chris Watts began to fill in the gaps, often with an unnerving matter-of-fact tone. He started to confirm what they had suspected, his detailed premeditation, the specific agonizing details of how he murdered Bella and Celeste, and the cold, calculated steps he took to dispose of their bodies. The patient, methodical approach of these seasoned professionals ultimately succeeded where initial interrogation tactics, aimed at obtaining a quick confession, had fallen short of extracting the complete, horrifying truth. These prison interviews would, for the first time, allow the world to hear the full story from the killer's own lips, revealing a level of depravity that surpassed even the darkest public imagination. While Chris Watts had admitted to strangling Shanann in his initial confession, that account was deliberately vague, framed as a reaction to her supposed killing of the girls. In the sterile environment of his prison interview, with no hope of freedom and under the patient, persistent questioning of investigators, the full, unvarnished horror of Shanann's last moments finally emerged. This detailed confession painted a chilling picture of calculated intent, far removed from any notion of spontaneous rage. Chris recounted that on the morning of August 13, 2018, Shanann returned from her business trip around 1:48 a.m. A heated argument quickly erupted. Shanann had confronted him directly about his affair and his desire for separation, having already noticed his profound emotional withdrawal. She stated that she knew about his affair and that she wanted a divorce, adding that he would never see the children again. In Chris's twisted narrative, this perceived threat to his children's custody, a threat he later admitted was fabricated, was the trigger for his ultimate act. He then described how, in their bedroom, he began to strangle her. This was not a quick, impulsive act born of blind fury, but a sustained, deliberate application of force. Shanann, pregnant with their third child, fought for her life with desperate intensity. She kicked, struggled, and bit his finger, leaving a distinct mark that would later corroborate his confession. Her resistance was a heartbreaking testament to her will to survive, even as her life was being brutally extinguished by the man who had vowed to protect her. Chris chillingly detailed the agonizing duration of the act. He estimated that it took between 4 to 6 minutes for Shanann to succumb. During this prolonged period, he felt no discernible remorse or panic. Instead, his account suggested a cold determination to see the act through to its completion. He described watching her eyes roll back, her body eventually going limp, and the horrifying sensation of life leaving her. This explicit timeline shattered any illusion of a crime committed in a momentary fit of passion, solidifying the terrifying premeditation of her murder. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this revelation was Chris Watts's psychological state as he recounted these details. His voice remained flat, his demeanor detached, devoid of any visible anguish or regret. There were no tears, no signs of a man tormented by the memory of taking his wife's life. He spoke of it with a chilling, almost clinical precision, as if describing a task completed. This profound absence of emotion in recounting Shanann's desperate struggle underscored the terrifying emptiness within him, a void where empathy and love should have been, confirming the depth of his psychopathy. The full confession of Shanann's murder, delivered with such dispassionate clarity from his prison cell, removed any lingering doubt about the cold, deliberate nature of his initial act. It exposed the true extent of his betrayal, revealing Shanann's final moments as a fight for survival against her husband. This agonizing truth then set the stage for the even more unfathomable horrors he would reveal about his daughters, completing the horrifying narrative of family annihilation. While Chris Watts's initial confession included the admission of strangling Shanann, the details were vague, shrouded in a self-serving narrative of rage and reaction to her supposed threat. It was in the chilling, unhurried confines of the prison interview room that Chris Watts finally laid bare the full, horrifying truth of Shanann's last moments, revealing a calculated brutality that eclipsed even the most harrowing initial assumptions. This detailed confession painted a picture not of spontaneous rage, but of cold, determined intent. Chris recounted how, after Shanann confronted him about his affair and his demand for separation, an argument escalated. He claimed she told him he would never see the children again, a statement that, in his distorted view, pushed him to the edge. It was then, in their bedroom, that he began to strangle her. Unlike his earlier attempts to paint it as an out-of-control act, his detailed confession revealed a terrifyingly methodical process. He described the act not as a brief burst of anger, but as a sustained, deliberate application of force. He chillingly detailed how Shanann fought back. She kicked, struggled, and resisted against his immense strength. She bit his finger, leaving a clear mark that would later serve as critical evidence confirming the struggle. Chris recounted how her eyes eventually rolled back and how her body went limp. He estimated the strangulation lasted between 4 to 6 minutes, a prolonged period of conscious, deliberate action, not a fleeting moment of unbridled fury. This time frame shattered any illusion of a sudden, impulsive act, solidifying the premeditated nature of her murder. Perhaps most disturbing was Chris Watts's recounting of his psychological state during this agonizing process. He spoke of it with an unnerving detachment, a chilling absence of the emotional turmoil one would expect. There was no mention of overwhelming panic, no breakdown, no visible sign of regret as he described taking the life of his pregnant wife. Instead, his account suggested a cold determination to achieve his objective, the elimination of the problem that stood in the way of his desired new life. This stark lack of emotion in recounting Shanann's final struggle underscored the profound emptiness within him, a void where empathy and love should have been. The revelation of these precise details was agonizing for Shanann's family and for the public. To learn that Shanann had fought so desperately to hear about her struggle and her biting him brought a new level of visceral horror to the tragedy. It confirmed that she was aware of what was happening, that her last moments were filled with terror and betrayal at the hands of the man who had promised to cherish her. Chris Watts's full confession of Shanann's murder, delivered with such dispassionate clarity from his prison cell, removed any lingering doubt about the cold, deliberate nature of his initial act, setting the stage for the even more unfathomable horrors he would then reveal about his daughters. The horror of Shanann Watts's murder in their bedroom was quickly followed by an even more chilling sequence of events, as Chris Watts, with a disturbing sense of calm, began to execute the next phases of his grotesque plan. In the immediate aftermath of taking his pregnant wife's life, his psychological state remained detached, cold, and utterly devoid of panic. He was not a man consumed by remorse, but rather a man driven by a singular, horrifying purpose to erase all traces of his former life. After Shanann lay lifeless, Chris's focus immediately shifted to logistics. He retrieved a bedsheet and wrapped her body, meticulously preparing it for transport. There was no hesitation, no frantic fumbling. His actions were methodical, suggesting a mind already conditioned to the task. It was at this critical juncture, while he was attempting to conceal his first victim, that the unimaginable nightmare escalated with the sudden appearance of his daughters. Bella, the inquisitive and intuitive 5-year-old, woke up. She had likely been disturbed by the commotion in her parents' bedroom, or simply by the early morning hour. She walked into the master bedroom, and in a moment of pure, heart-wrenching innocence, asked her father, "What's wrong with Mommy?" The sight of her mother, motionless and wrapped in a sheet, should have shattered any semblance of Chris's composure. Instead, he maintained his terrifying facade, lying to his eldest daughter, telling her that Mommy is sick. He instructed her to go back to bed, displaying a chilling capacity for deception even to his own child. Soon after, Celeste, the sweet 3-year-old, also woke up. She too likely sensed the disturbance or was simply drawn by the sounds. Chris led both girls to the truck, where Shanann's body was already being loaded. His decision to take the girls with him, rather than leave them safely at home, was a critical turning point that defied any logical explanation. It revealed an ultimate monstrous intent that extended beyond Shanann. He later claimed in prison that he couldn't leave them with Shanann's body, a twisted justification that only underscored his depravity. The image of Chris Watts calmly interacting with his innocent daughters, who were likely sleepy and confused as he prepared to transport their murdered mother, is one of the most agonizing details of the entire case. He was the picture of chilling control, carrying out his plan with a disturbing efficiency. There was no visible struggle or panic on his part, only a cold determination. He loaded Shanann's body into the back of his work truck, then secured his 2 small, unsuspecting daughters in the back seat, strapping them into their car seats for what they believed was a routine trip, but what was, in fact, their final journey. The immediate aftermath in the house laid bare the terrifying reality of Chris Watts, a man utterly devoid of conscience, capable of executing the most heinous acts with a chilling, detached calm. The drive from the Watts family home in Frederick to the remote Anadarko oil site was perhaps the most chilling leg of Chris Watts's monstrous plan. In the pre-dawn hours of August 13th, 2018, with Shanann's wrapped body already loaded into the back of his work truck, Chris strapped his two innocent daughters, Bella and Celeste, into their car seats in the back seat. What to them was a routine early morning drive with Daddy was, in reality, a terrifying journey to their deaths. A betrayal so profound it defied human comprehension. As the truck moved through the quiet, awakening streets, a terrifying silence must have filled the cab, punctuated only by the innocent sounds of two small children. Chris Watts later recounted fragments of this journey in his prison confessions. He claimed that Bella and Celeste were largely quiet, perhaps still groggy from being woken so early. He described them singing quietly, their voices a haunting counterpoint to the macabre cargo and the dark intent of their father. This detail of their innocent singing as he drove them to their doom underscored the unfathomable depths of his cruelty and detachment. The journey itself was a brutal act of psychological torture. Chris Watts was driving not only the body of his murdered wife, but also his still living children, whom he already intended to kill. Every mile traversed, every turn of the wheel, brought them closer to their horrific fate. The profound irony was lost on no one. Chris Watts, whose job involved working at these very oil fields, was now using his professional access to facilitate the unspeakable. The familiar landscape of his daily commute was transformed into a landscape of ultimate betrayal. Investigators found the details of this drive particularly disturbing. How could a father sit calmly, listening to his children sing, knowing that he was moments away from extinguishing their lives? Chris Watts's account from prison offered no true emotional insight into his state during this period. He described his actions with the same chilling detachment he applied to the murder of Shanann. There was no confession of panic, no breakdown of conscience, only a methodical progression towards his predetermined goal. This chilling composure, during such an inherently agonizing journey, spoke volumes about his profound lack of empathy and the terrifying success of his psychological dissociation. For Shanann's family, learning the specifics of this drive was an additional layer of torment. To imagine Bella and Celeste, awake and trusting, being driven by their father to a desolate place where their lives would be cruelly taken, added an unbearable dimension to their grief. The image of those innocent faces in the rearview mirror, unaware of the horror unfolding, became a permanent, agonizing part of their understanding of the tragedy. The drive to the oil field was not just a physical journey for Chris Watts. It was a descent into an abyss of unimaginable evil, a testament to his chilling capacity to execute his horrifying plan with unwavering resolve. Upon arriving at the desolate Anadarko oil site, Chris Watts commenced the final, most unspeakable phase of his plan. With Shanann's body already in the back of his truck, his attention turned to his two living daughters. It was here, in the quiet, desolate expanse of the oil field, that he committed the acts that would forever solidify his place as one of the most reviled murderers in recent history. And it was Bella, his intelligent and spirited 5-year-old, who was forced to confront the horror of her father's ultimate betrayal. In his chilling prison confessions, Chris Watts recounted the agonizing details of Bella's murder. He removed her from the truck, likely to a spot near the oil tanks. Unlike her younger sister, Celeste, Bella was acutely aware of what was happening. She was awake, she was conscious, and she resisted her father's monstrous intentions. Her final moments were filled with terror and a desperate struggle for survival. Chris described how Bella pleaded with him, her innocent voice cutting through the silence of the remote field. She cried out, "Daddy, no!" Her words, filled with fear and confusion, were the last coherent sounds she made to the man who was meant to protect her. She fought back, using her small body to push against her father, attempting to escape his grasp. Her resistance was a heartbreaking testament to her will to live, a desperate effort to fight against the unimaginable. The method Chris used to end Bella's life was smothering. He confessed to using his own hands or a blanket to suffocate her. The act was prolonged, not a sudden event. He recounted how her struggle continued, how her pleas eventually faded, and how her small body finally went limp. This agonizing detail, that Bella was actively aware and fought against her father as he took her life, stands as one of the most profoundly disturbing revelations of the entire case. It shattered any lingering illusions that the children were simply unconscious or unaware during their final moments. Chris Watts recounted these unspeakable details with the same chilling detachment that defined his earlier confessions. There was no apparent anguish, no visible sign of the torment that such a memory should evoke. His voice remained flat, his demeanor calm, as he described smothering his own daughter while she pleaded for her life. This cold, robotic retelling underscored the terrifying psychological void within him, a complete absence of empathy or remorse for the child he had murdered. For investigators, and for the public, Bella's last plea, "Daddy, no," became the most haunting echo of the entire tragedy. It crystallized the unimaginable betrayal and the profound horror inflicted upon an innocent child by the very person who was supposed to be her safe harbor. This agonizing detail solidified Chris Watts's guilt beyond any doubt, and forever cemented the true, monstrous nature of his crimes, revealing a level of calculated cruelty that few could ever truly comprehend. Following the unimaginable horror of Bella's murder, Chris Watts turned his attention to his younger daughter, Celeste. The details of Celeste's death, as recounted by her father in the desolate prison interview room, completed the horrifying tableau of family annihilation. While Bella's final moments were marked by desperate resistance, Celeste's end was characterized by a terrifying quietness, a profound innocence tragically extinguished by the very hand meant to protect her. Chris Watts confessed that after smothering Bella, he placed her body on the ground near the oil tanks. His focus then shifted to 3-year-old Celeste. Whether she was still in the truck, or if he had already brought her out, the specifics of her precise location in those moments are less clear than the agonizing certainty of her fate. What is known, from Chris's own words, is that he then proceeded to murder Celeste. Celeste, being younger and perhaps less aware of the immediate threat than Bella, did not exhibit the same desperate struggle. Chris recounted how she remained largely quiet, perhaps confused, as he smothered her. He used a similar method, suffocating her with his hands or possibly a blanket. The absence of a fierce fight, the quiet resignation of a 3-year-old in the face of absolute betrayal, painted an even more chilling picture of vulnerability and powerlessness. Her small, innocent life was extinguished without the desperate pleas that marked her sister's final moments. The profound tragedy of Celeste's death lies in her age and utter helplessness. She was a child of pure innocence, utterly dependent on her father for safety and love. Her quiet passing at his hands in a remote and desolate location underscored the chilling depths of Chris Watts's depravity. He performed the act not as a panicked father, but as a cold, determined executioner, focused solely on the completion of his monstrous plan. Throughout his detailed recounting of Celeste's murder, Chris Watts maintained the same unnerving emotional detachment that characterized his entire confession. There was no visible sign of anguish, no breakdown, no apparent remorse for taking the life of his youngest daughter. He spoke of the act with a clinical, almost robotic tone, as if detailing a mundane task rather than the murder of his own child. This chilling composure, even when describing the extinguishment of such pure innocence, underscored the terrifying reality of his psychological state. The murder of Celeste Watts marked the completion of Chris's unthinkable crime. He had systematically eliminated his entire family, his pregnant wife, his lively 5-year-old, and his quiet 3-year-old. The confession of Celeste's tragic end, delivered with such dispassionate clarity from his prison cell, solidified the comprehensive nature of his evil. It left no doubt that Chris Watts was solely responsible for the annihilation of his family, removing any lingering questions about culpability and forever sealing the terrifying truth of his actions. The completion of these two horrifying acts then led him to the final, chilling step of his meticulously planned disposal. Having extinguished the lives of his wife and 2 daughters, Chris Watts proceeded with the final, most gruesome phase of his plan, the methodical disposal of their bodies at the remote Anadarko oil site. In his prison confessions, he provided chilling, step-by-step details of these acts, painting a picture of cold, calculated precision that underscored the complete dehumanization of his family. His actions were not those of a panicked killer, but of a man executing a preconceived plan with chilling efficiency. Chris first focused on his daughters, Bella and Celeste. He confessed to carrying their small bodies to the large crude oil tanks on the site. These were not water tanks, but vats containing thick, dark, noxious crude oil, highly corrosive and designed to store petroleum products. The opening at the top of these tanks was relatively small, forcing him to maneuver the bodies through a narrow aperture. He described pushing Bella's body through the hatch first, then Celeste's, into the dark, viscous liquid below. The act of forcing his children into the oil, knowing they would sink and dissolve, revealed an unparalleled level of callousness. It was an act of ultimate desecration, an attempt to obliterate their very existence. After disposing of his daughters in the oil tanks, Chris then turned his attention to Shanann's body. He dragged her remains, still wrapped in the bedsheet, to a location approximately 100 yards away from the tanks. There, he dug a shallow grave by hand, using a shovel he had brought or found on site. He buried her in the earth, covering her with dirt. This final act of concealment, burying his pregnant wife in a desolate field, completed the physical eradication of his family, an attempt to wipe away all traces of the life he had so brutally cast aside. Throughout these horrifying acts of disposal, Chris Watts maintained the same unnerving composure that characterized his entire confession. He spoke of the physical exertion involved, the weight of the bodies, the effort of pushing them through the tank hatches, the digging of the grave, but without a flicker of emotional distress. His voice remained flat, his narrative purely descriptive, as if recounting a mundane chore rather than the disposal of his murdered family. This chilling detachment emphasized his profound psychological state, a complete disconnect from the monstrous reality of his actions. The meticulous details of the disposal, as revealed in his prison confessions, were particularly agonizing for Shanann's family. To learn precisely how their beloved Bella and Celeste were forced into the oil tanks and how Shanann was buried in a shallow grave added an unbearable layer of suffering to their grief. It left no room for doubt about the extent of Chris Watts's depravity and his calculated intent to destroy every vestige of his family. The crude oil tanks, symbols of his work, became the final horrific resting place for his innocent daughters, cementing the indelible image of his monstrous betrayal. The methodical nature of the disposal underscored that his actions were not impulsive, but the chilling culmination of a meticulously planned act of annihilation. The horrifying details revealed in Chris Watts's prison confessions did more than just recount the moments of murder and disposal. They laid bare the chilling depth of his premeditation and the meticulously orchestrated cover-up that followed. His actions, both before and after the murders, demonstrated a calculated resolve, dismantling any lingering notion that his crimes were merely a spontaneous act of rage. Chris Watts was not just a killer, but a master deceiver who had carefully plotted his escape from his family, viewing them as obstacles to be removed. His increasing emotional detachment from Shanann, the sudden surge in his physical fitness, and the intense focus on his affair were all, in retrospect, subtle yet undeniable precursors to his ultimate plan. While he never explicitly stated a precise date he decided to kill them, his actions painted a clear picture of a man steadily progressing towards family annihilation. The internet searches for methods of murder and body disposal, previously seen as isolated incidents, now took on their true, terrifying meaning. They were research, part of his premeditated scheme to achieve his desired freedom. The very method of disposal, placing the girls in the oil tanks and Shanann in a shallow grave at his workplace, demonstrated forethought, leveraging his access and knowledge of the remote site. Immediately following the disposal of his family at the Anadarko oil field, Chris Watts embarked on an elaborate and chillingly effective cover-up. He returned to work, calmly continuing his shift as if nothing untoward had happened. This ability to resume normal activities after committing such atrocities spoke volumes about his profound psychological detachment. He then initiated the fabricated missing persons report, calling police and feigning concern for his missing wife and daughters. His performance during these initial hours and days was a masterpiece of deception, designed to mislead investigators and elicit public sympathy. His lies were meticulously crafted and delivered with unwavering conviction. He spun a narrative of Shanann having taken the girls and left after an argument, a story designed to deflect suspicion and sow doubt. His televised plea, broadcast to millions, was a particularly chilling display of his manipulative prowess. With tearless eyes and a trembling voice, he appealed for his family's return, a performance that convinced many and delayed the inevitable discovery of his monstrous acts. He even texted Shanann, creating a false trail of communication, maintaining the illusion that she was still alive and possibly in contact with him. Furthermore, his cover-up extended to the disposal of evidence. While not detailed in public confessions, it's understood he tried to eliminate traces that could incriminate him. His attempts to deflect suspicion by claiming Shanann was the culprit for the girl's deaths, even after confessing to strangling her, further underscored his deep-seated need to control the narrative and minimize his own culpability. Every action Chris Watts took, from the moments leading up to the murders to his initial public appearances, was a cold, calculated act of premeditation and deceit, revealing a chilling capacity for manipulation that truly shocked the world. These revelations from prison solidified the image of Chris Watts not as a man who snapped, but as a cunning, cold-blooded killer. Having committed the unspeakable acts at the Anadarko oil field, Chris Watts returned to his seemingly ordinary life, embarking on a meticulous and chillingly effective cover-up. The revelations from his prison confessions underscored the calculated nature of his deception, proving him not just a killer, but a master manipulator who spun a web of lies to conceal his monstrous deeds. Every action he took in the crucial hours and days after the murders was a deliberate performance, designed to deflect suspicion and maintain his fabricated narrative of a distraught husband and father. Immediately after disposing of his family's bodies, Chris returned home and then proceeded to his job at Anadarko Petroleum as if nothing had happened. This act of normalcy, going to work just hours after annihilating his family, was the first chilling testament to his psychological detachment. He worked his shift, interacting with colleagues, presenting the facade of a man going about his routine. This ability to compartmentalize and perform under such extreme circumstances hinted at a deeply disturbed psyche, capable of separating emotion from action with unnerving ease. The true test of his manipulative prowess began when Shanann's friend, Nicole Atkinson, arrived at the Watts home, concerned after Shanann missed an important appointment. Chris met her with a fabricated story. Shanann had taken the girls and left after an argument in the early hours. His demeanor was calm, almost too calm, as he relayed this tale. When police arrived for a welfare check, Chris continued his performance, inviting them into the house, feigning concern, and allowing them to search, all while knowing the horrific truth he was concealing. He even helped by looking for Shanann's phone and wallet, items he knew were not in the house. The most infamous display of his manipulative genius came during his televised appeal for his family's return. Standing before cameras, Chris Watts delivered a performance that captivated and, for a time, convinced millions. With a seemingly trembling voice and downcast eyes, he pleaded for Shanann and the girls to come home, directly addressing them and articulating the heartache of a missing family. His body language was carefully controlled, no tears, but a visible struggle for composure. His words were chosen to evoke sympathy and reinforce his fabricated narrative. This chilling performance was lauded by some as genuine emotion, but for others, it felt unsettlingly inauthentic, a feeling later confirmed by his full confession. Throughout this period, Chris also maintained his elaborate lies to Nicole Kessinger, his mistress. He continued to assure her that his divorce was proceeding, that his family was out of his life, and that their future together was clear. His ability to sustain this dual life, juggling the demands of a murder investigation, a public performance of grief, and a burgeoning romantic relationship, showcased an extraordinary capacity for deception and a terrifying lack of conscience. Every text message he sent, every call he took, every interaction he had was a calculated step in his desperate, yet initially effective, cover-up. The master manipulator had played his role to perfection, but the truth, as revealed in his prison confessions, would ultimately strip away every layer of his elaborate deceit. For seasoned law enforcement professionals, accustomed to confronting the darkest aspects of human behavior, the Chris Watts case presented a unique and profoundly disturbing challenge. While they had secured a conviction, the full, unvarnished truth of the murders remained largely concealed. It was during the February 2019 prison interviews that investigators like CBI agent Tammy Lee and FBI agent Graham Coder finally heard the complete, agonizing narrative from Chris Watts himself. The experience of sitting across from the man who had murdered his family, listening to his dispassionate recounting of such heinous acts, left an indelible mark. The primary impact was the sheer weight of the details. Unlike his initial evasive confession, Chris Watts in prison laid bare the step-by-step reality of his crimes: Shanann's struggle, Bella's desperate pleas, and Celeste's quiet, tragic end. Hearing these precise actions directly from the perpetrator added a new layer of visceral horror that even experienced investigators found difficult to process. They were no longer dealing with inferences or fragmented evidence. They were receiving a first-hand account of ultimate betrayal and depravity, articulated with chilling clarity. Agent Tammy Lee, in particular, was praised for her methodical and empathetic approach, which ultimately encouraged Chris to speak. Yet this very proximity to the confession came at a profound personal cost. To listen to a father describe smothering his daughters while they cried out for him, to hear the clinical details of their disposal, tested the limits of professional detachment. The emotional burden of holding such horrific truths, knowing the immense suffering endured by the victims, was immense. Investigators often build a protective barrier around themselves, but some cases, particularly those involving children, pierce through that defense. The continued absence of genuine emotion from Chris Watts throughout these revelations was another deeply unsettling factor. As he recounted the most gruesome details, his voice remained flat, his demeanor calm, devoid of any discernible remorse or distress. This chilling composure was a constant reminder of the profound psychological chasm that separated him from the human emotions of grief, guilt, or regret. For the investigators, this lack of empathy was perhaps as disturbing as the crimes themselves, signaling a level of coldness that transcended typical criminal psychology. It solidified their understanding that they were dealing with a deeply disturbed individual, capable of unspeakable acts without apparent compunction. Despite the emotional toll, there was a grim satisfaction in finally obtaining the full truth. For the investigators, knowing every agonizing detail meant that Shanann, Bella, and Celeste's stories could be fully told. It meant that Chris Watts' attempts to manipulate the narrative were finally and definitively exposed. This comprehensive confession eliminated all lingering doubts about his sole culpability and the meticulous nature of his crimes, providing a definitive record for posterity. While the truth was horrifying, it was the truth, and that provided a form of justice for the victims and their grieving family. The impact on these investigators, however, was a lifelong burden, a testament to the shadows they walk through in pursuit of justice. When the details of Chris Watts' prison confessions were finally released to the public, the world collectively recoiled in a renewed wave of shock and unadulterated horror. Already deeply disturbed by the initial events and sentencing, audiences around the globe were now confronted with a level of depravity that surpassed even the darkest imaginings. The meticulously recounted horrors from Chris's own lips extinguished any lingering flicker of doubt or sympathy, cementing his image as one of the most profoundly evil figures in modern true crime. The details that elicited the most widespread and visceral reaction were, without question, those concerning the murders of Bella and Celeste. Hearing Chris recount Bella's desperate plea of "Daddy, no," as he smothered her, and the tragic quietness of 3-year-old Celeste's final moments sent shivers down the spines of millions. These agonizing specifics shattered the last remnants of public composure, transforming an already horrific narrative into something truly unspeakable. The deliberate act of a father extinguishing his own children's lives, with their conscious awareness and pleas, tapped into a primal fear and outrage that transcended cultural boundaries. Equally horrifying were the details of the body disposal, the clinical description of forcing his daughter's small bodies through the narrow hatches of crude oil tanks, and Shanann's burial in a shallow grave. This methodical, dehumanizing process revealed a chilling calculation that defied any notion of a moment of rage. It painted a picture of a man utterly devoid of conscience, meticulously executing a plan to erase his family's existence. The public reacted with profound disgust, condemning the cold precision with which he desecrated the very lives he had created. The release of these full confessions had a profound impact on public perception of the case. Any lingering questions about Chris Watts's sole culpability, or whether there were any mitigating factors, were definitively answered. The narrative became unequivocally clear. Chris Watts was a premeditated, remorseless killer. His earlier attempts to blame Shanann, to portray himself as a victim, were now fully exposed as grotesque lies, further fueling public contempt. The public's initial confusion and disbelief shifted to absolute condemnation, cementing his status as one of the most universally reviled individuals. Social media platforms, already a central arena for discussing the case, erupted with renewed fury. Discussions moved from speculation to outright condemnation as users expressed their horror, sorrow, and outrage. News channels and true crime commentators across the globe analyzed every sentence of his confession, attempting to grapple with the depths of his evil. The Chris Watts case, with these added layers of chilling detail, became a central case study for understanding the psychology of family annihilators and the terrifying reality of hidden violence within seemingly normal homes. The full confession, while agonizing, provided a terrifying completeness, allowing the public to understand the full scope of the tragedy, even if true comprehension remained elusive. It served as a final, definitive testament to the monstrous acts of Christopher Watts. With the chilling details of Chris Watts's prison confessions laid bare, the public finally possessed the complete, agonizing truth of how Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were murdered. The meticulous account of strangulation, the desperate pleas, the quiet suffocations, and the ultimate disposal in the dark, viscous oil tanks painted a horrifying picture of a premeditated family annihilation. The what and the how were now definitively known, stripping away all of Chris Watts's initial lies, and leaving no doubt about his singular, monstrous culpability. Yet, even with this terrifying clarity, the deepest and most fundamental question continued to loom, forever beyond reach, the profound and disturbing why. Despite Chris Watts offering motives, his affair, his desire for a new life, the perceived obstacles his family represented, these explanations felt woefully inadequate to comprehend the scale of his evil. How could a seemingly normal husband and father, celebrated in family photos and described as quiet and unassuming, transition so seamlessly to a remorseless killer of his own children? The prison confessions, while explicit in their details, offered little genuine insight into the psychological chasm that allowed him to commit such acts. His continued flat affect, his dispassionate recounting of horrific violence, and his apparent lack of true remorse indicated a mind operating on a different plane of existence, one where empathy and human connection held no sway. For psychologists and criminologists, the Watts case remains a complex and disturbing study. It defies easy categorization, challenging conventional understandings of violent crime. Chris Watts did not fit the typical profile of a domestic abuser with a history of violence, nor did he display overt signs of severe mental illness that might explain such a break from reality. He was, by all outward appearances, a quiet killer, a terrifying reminder that monstrous capabilities can reside within the most ordinary exteriors. The truth revealed was agonizing, but the fundamental understanding of how such a transformation occurs in a seemingly normal individual continued to elude absolute comprehension. The impact of this revealed truth extended far beyond the immediate shock. For Shanann's family, receiving these details brought an agonizing, visceral closure, knowing every detail of their loved one's final moments, even if it meant confronting unimaginable pain. For the investigators who painstakingly extracted these confessions, it was a grim victory, providing the ultimate factual clarity but leaving them to grapple with the profound evil they had witnessed. For the public, the case became a chilling benchmark, forever shaping discussions about domestic violence, the vulnerability of children, and the terrifying secrets that can be hidden behind closed doors. Ultimately, the Chris Watts case stands as a stark testament to a truth revealed, but never truly understood. We know precisely what he did, and a superficial explanation for why he did it. But the deeper, terrifying why, how a human being can descend into such cold-blooded, calculated depravity against his own flesh and blood, remains an enduring mystery, a haunting question that continues to echo in the collective consciousness. It serves as a permanent reminder that some evils, once exposed, defy rational explanation, leaving only the profound weight of their horrific reality. The legal chapter may have closed, but the ripple effects of Chris Watts's unspeakable acts continue to reverberate, requiring ongoing vigilance and remembrance of the lives so brutally taken.